So, as an ardent fan of Daniel Greene, I was naturally excited when I heard about his first published book. As many fans know, Breach of Peace is the first novella in a trilogy leading up to Daniel's main series, which will be taking place in a much broader, more vibrant world with more geographical regions to explore, more diverse groups of people, and maybe even some creatures to see. So when I first heard that the book was only going to be 140 pages long, I began to wonder, how can Daniel give us a satisfying introduction to this massive, vibrant world that we know is coming with only 140 pages, with such a small page count? And what I discovered reading through this was a simple but rather elegant story structure, one that I'm going to try to break down for you. So, what is the purpose of the beginning of a story? Well, many people would say that it's supposed to establish characters as well as establish the setting. And although this is technically true, I prefer to think of it in a slightly different way. For me, the first purpose of the beginning of a story is to establish an initial status quo, or an initial state of affairs. This status quo can be about anything from the physical setting to the internal mental state of some character. The initial quo is the set of initial conditions that the story begins in. The second purpose of the beginning of a story is to introduce some incitement of conflict or a change in the situation. We have an initial status quo, but now something needs to happen to disrupt it. And this incitement of conflict is what precipitates into the following series events that make up the rest of the story. In a very linear or sequential structure, an author would establish the initial quo with descriptions of the world or character moments, and then they would introduce some incitement of conflict. But what Breach of Peace does is it does these two things at the same time. The very beginning of the book opens up on a murder scene right there on the first page. And people who've read it know that this is the incitement of the main conflict, and it's happening almost immediately. It is happening immediately. But it also sets the initial status quo. We are introduced to our main characters, who, as police inspectors, actually have a reason to be involved with this conflict. And although the crime scene is rather intense and extraordinary, even for these police officers, it still sheds light on what normal business would be like for our main characters. They've all been to crime scenes, and therefore we get to see what their regular thought processes are, their interpersonal interactions with each other, as well as their personality quirks. And most importantly, for this story, we get to see Chlid's attitudes towards the Empire. She's a very loyal subject. She believes the Empire is a force for good. She believes that the police serve and are loved by the common people. And we also see her faith for her God. These components are the main meat that make up the initial status quo. They are the conditions that the story begins with. The key thing here is that the opening crime scene introduces the conflict while simultaneously establishing the initial status quo. Not only does this cut down on the page count, but it also makes for a much better paced and engaging introduction. In effect, we are seeing the conflict coming to light while also seeing what initial conditions are about to be disrupted by that conflict. So once the status quo has been established and we've introduced the main conflict, we then watch a series of events unfold that constitute the meat of the rest of the story. In the case of Breach of Peace, what we see is a clash of the old conditions and of the new situation. Chlid and her colleagues have been established as loyal to the Empire, but when evidence suggesting Ministry of Defense involvement in the crime begins to surface, they are forced to contend with this new reality. Initially, they do so by assuming that it's only a single corrupt individual who is responsible, However, they maintain their loyalty and confidence in the initial status quo, that the institutions they serve are mostly infallible and ultimately a force for good. This ultimately comes to a head when an anointed kills Chlid's husband as well as the rest of her precinct. At this point, the introduced conflict has completely subverted the initial status quo. In the beginning, from the point of view of the main characters as well as the reader, the Empire and God were seen as good entities. But now we have the highest figure in the Empire, an anointed, acting on the will of God, completely betraying the faith that Chlid had put in them. With everything being taken from her, Chlid is now staunchly, very much anti-empire. The ending resolution is one that gives us a set of conditions that are different than the ones we began with. So the overall story structure can be described as 1. Establish an initial status quo while simultaneously introducing elements of a new situation or conflict, and then 2. Raising the tension by having the new situation clash with the initial status quo, which doesn't want to be replaced easily, whether these are physical obstacles or, in the case of this book, mental or ideological obstacles. This then leads to a climax and then ends on a resolution where the ending state of affairs is now different from what we started with at the very beginning of the story. Breach of Peace follows this almost step by step. The crime scene and early investigation establish our main character's views and loyalties while also feeding elements of the new conflict. The tensions then begin to rise when we begin to suspect the Empire, which conflicts with much of the preconceptions established by the initial status quo. The climax is then reached when we face off with the Anointed at the warehouse, and the resolution comes about when Chlid is now fully anti-Empire. She hates the thing that she not too long ago had blind loyalty to. This storytelling structure may seem straightforward and obvious, but like with many things, it's important to return to the fundamentals, to remind us of how this stuff works at a most basic level. In a story, things happen, and if things are happening, that usually means that things are changing. So when you are crafting a story, you must begin with one state of affairs and end with a different one.